The candles in the Ashworth assembly rooms had been burning for 2 hours when Cecily Vane walked through the door, and the first thing she heard was laughter. Not the musical variety, the kind that rose from card tables and champagne flutes and the pleased exchanges of women who had arrived in carriages with crests on the doors. This laughter had a different texture. It came from the alcove to her left, where Lady Fenwick sat with her daughter and 2 young women in pale silk, and it followed Cecily like a second shadow across the threshold as she stepped into the light. She knew, without looking down, what they were laughing at. She had known it before she left the lodging-house on Barrow Street, when she pressed the seams of the gown for the 3rd time, and still could not make the left hem lie correctly, when she pinned the collar with the last pin she possessed, and stood before the small mirror, and told herself it was sufficient. The gown was cream. Once, 3 seasons of careful wearing had given it the color of old paper. The trim at the cuffs had been replaced with ribbon twice, and the ribbon itself had frayed at the right wrist. She had covered that fraying with a glove, and the glove was the best thing she owned. Kid leather, pale gray, a gift from her mother, the year before her mother died. Cecily did not stop walking. She moved through the room the way she had learned to move through every room that winter. Steadily, without haste, her chin level and her hands still at her sides. Because the alternative was to stand in the doorway and allow the alcove to win the opening exchange. She came to a stop near the wall of windows that overlooked the street, and stood with her back to the glass, and looked out at the assembly room, and thought, with a clarity she had not expected to feel, that she would rather be anywhere else on earth. "Miss Vane?" She turned. The voice belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, wife to one of her father's former solicitors, a small woman with kind eyes and too much lace at her throat. "I am glad you came. I was not certain you would." "Sir taxed." "I promised my aunt," Cecily said. Her aunt was Mrs. Drummond, who could not attend herself on account of a cold she had been cultivating since October. Drummond had nonetheless pressed 3 shillings into Cecily's hand and told her she must go. That a girl of 23, with no fortune and no prospects, could not afford to be invisible a second winter running. And Cecily had not argued because she did not have the energy left to argue with anyone. She had arrived, which was something. She was still here. If you have ever stood in a room that has already decided what you are, you will know what it cost her. Stay a little longer with this story. It was Mrs. Bess Hartwell who pointed him out, not intentionally, but by the sudden slight shift in her posture that women in public rooms performed when a certain quality of attention entered the space. Cecily followed the shift and found the Marquess of Aldenmere standing near the far staircase alone, which was unusual, and not speaking to anyone, which was more so. She had heard of him. Everyone in this county had heard of him. He had returned from the continent 14 months ago to claim the title on the death of his elder brother. And in those 14 months he had attended no assemblies, accepted no dinner invitations, and appeared in public only at the churchyard of St. Giles on the Hill, where it was said he went every Thursday morning without fail. The gossips could not agree on what he went to do there. Some said he knelt, some said he simply stood. All agreed he stood for a very long time. He was 34, she had been told. He looked older than that, not in the way of dissipation, but in the way of someone who had spent a long time keeping his face still. His coat was dark, navy or something near it, and he wore it correctly, everything in order, the cravat white and precise, the breeches light, the boots without ornament. He held a glass he had not touched. He did not look around the room with the speculative air of a man assessing which women were marriageable and which were not. He looked at no one. And then, without any visible transition, he looked at Cecily. She looked away first. She was practiced at looking away. The laughter from the alcove reached her again, sometime around 10 o'clock, distinct from the general noise, and this time it arrived with words attached. She did not turn around. She was speaking with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pell, about a scheme to establish a lending library in the village, a project Cecily had been quietly working toward for the better part of a year, and she would not give up that conversation for the sake of an alcove full of women in silk. The girl in the worn gown, she heard. "Pomend." But the voice was Lady Fenwick's daughter, Miss Winifred Fenwick, who was 19 and very beautiful, and had a habit of saying precisely what she thought at a volume just sufficient to be heard by the person she was discussing. I cannot imagine what she hoped to accomplish by coming. She cannot afford a new gown. She cannot afford a season. She cannot afford a dowry. What exactly is she proposing to offer? Nothing at all, said Lady Fenwick gently, which was worse than if she had said it sharply. Poor thing. Cecily felt Mrs. Pell's hand touch her arm. Not pressing, not drawing attention, just there. The library, Cecily said. I believe Mrs. Drummond's collection would make an admirable foundation if the parish would agree to house it. Mrs. Pell agreed that it would. They talked for another 10 minutes. Cecily did not look at the alcove. What she did not know, because she had not permitted herself to look, was that he had heard Miss Fenwick's remark and had been still for the 3 heartbeats that followed it in the particular way of a man suppressing an immediate response. She was introduced to him by accident. Lord Cowell, a genial man who had known her father and still spoke to Cecily with warmth, brought the Marquess across the room on the pretext of discussing a drainage matter on the eastern edge of the estate, and the introduction happened in the space between one conversation and the next, almost before she had arranged her face. Miss Vane, Lord Cowell said. His lordship, the Marquess of Aldenmere. She curtsied. He bowed. The bow was correct and nothing more, and she thought that was all it would be. Until he said, Lord Cowell tells me you are the principal organizer of the lending library proposal. I would not say principal, she said. I have written some letters and spoken to some people. Lord Cowell says you have single-handedly secured 3 donations, and the promise of a room from the parish council. Lord Cowell is generous in his characterization. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. It was not a smile. It was the precursor to a smile. Arrested. I am Aldenmere, he said, as if she might have forgotten. My library has 1,200 volumes. I no longer read. I wonder if you might be persuaded to allow me to donate some of them. She looked at him directly for the first time. Because the offer surprised her, and she had not yet learned to suppress the expression of being surprised. 1,200, she said. A donation of 50 would not embarrass the project, he said. I could have my steward draw up a list. That would be very useful, she said. Thank you, my lord. He nodded once. Lord Cowell was already pulling him toward the drainage matter. Cecily stood for a moment after they had gone and breathed carefully, and told herself it was the room's heat, the press of bodies and candles that had produced the sudden warmth along her collarbone. Nothing more than that. She left an hour later before the final dances, because her shoes were thin and the cobblestones would be cold, and she had a long walk. The parish council met on the 12th of November, and it was there that Cecily first understood what the Aldenmere Library proposal would require of her. The council agreed to the room, and the vicar agreed to maintain the catalogue, and a local merchant offered to fund the first quarter's candles, and all of this was very well. It was only when Mr. Pembury, the council chairman, produced a letter from Aldenmere's steward that Cecily understood the donation involved not 50 volumes but 170, and that the Marquess himself intended to visit the proposed room on the 23rd of November to assess whether the shelving was adequate to house them. She went home and rewrote her catalogue plan 3 times. He arrived on the 23rd precisely at 11, his steward at his shoulder, and a groom holding 2 horses in the street. The room was in the old schoolmaster's house, cold and smelling of plaster, with shelves that the vicar and 2 of his parishioners had put up the previous weekend. Cecily had spent the morning arranging the books already donated along the lower shelves, making them look like more than they were, because she was practical and understood that the appearance of progress was itself a form of progress. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he entered. He looked at the shelves, at the books she had arranged, at the catalogue pages she had laid out on the central table. He looked at her hands and the ink stain on the right forefinger, which she had not managed to remove entirely. You wrote the catalogue yourself, he said. The vicar helped with the theology volumes, she said. He walked to the shelves and looked at the spines and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "This is sound work." She said, "Thank you, my lord," and felt the words insufficiently small for what she wanted to say. She wanted to say that she had been working on this for 9 months, since before her father died and left them with nothing, since before she understood what nothing actually meant, since before she moved into Mrs. Drummond's lodging house and started giving piano lessons to the Chandlers' daughters for 2 shillings a week. She had started this because she believed the village library was necessary and she could make it possible, and she was still working on it because she did not know what she was if she stopped. She said none of this. She showed him the shelving plan. He asked questions that were precise and practical, the questions of someone who had thought about the problem before arriving. His steward took notes. At noon, he said he would return with the books in the first week of December, and he left. The steward paused in the doorway and turned back. "His lordship instructed me to tell you," he said, "that if you find the catalogue requires assistance, the estate's archivist is available on Tuesdays." She stood very still after they had gone. The offer was absurd. The estate's archivist. As if she were organizing something that merited an archivist, rather than a village charity run on borrowed shelves and goodwill. She knew better than to read too much into it. He was a man of resource, who had seen a project he approved of and offered a practical assistance he could provide without cost to himself. That was all. She told herself this for several days and almost believed it. December came with cold that settled into the stones of every building in the village and refused to leave. Cecily gave piano lessons in the mornings and worked on the catalogue in the afternoons, and went to her aunt's lodgings for dinner on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and she kept her coat buttoned and did not complain about the cold in the schoolmaster's room because she was the one who had chosen to work there. The books arrived from Aldenmere on the 3rd of December, in 4 crates carried by 2 men from the estate. 172 volumes. Cecily counted them. The steward's list was precise and alphabetized. She spent 2 days incorporating them into the catalogue. On the 5th of December, she arrived at the room to find the Marquess already there, standing in his coat before the shelves with a volume open in his hand. She stopped in the doorway. He did not hear her at first, or seemed not to. He was reading. She had not seen him read anything before, and there was something in his face as he read that she had not seen there in the assembly room or the parish council chamber, something that was almost ease. Then he heard her, or felt, the cold from the open door, and closed the book. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord," she said, "I did not expect you." "Nor I. You, at this hour." He looked at the ink stain on her finger. It had migrated since November to the middle finger as well. "The catalogue proceeds?" "It is nearly complete." He looked at the shelves. He said, "My brother began a library of his own. At the estate. He did not live to finish it." He said it quietly, without inflection. But she heard the shape of what was underneath. "I am sorry," she said. "He died in April of last year." He put the volume back on the shelf with a care that was more than habit. He was the better reader. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had just offered her, which was the closest thing to an interior she had been given. She stood and let it be there, and after a moment he turned from the shelf and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely name, and then he said, "You have," added the Montaigne. "It was among the donations." "I know. I sent it." A pause. "It is an unusual donation for a village library." "I thought it might be read," he said. "I thought you might read it." She did not look away from him. She understood, in the particular precision of that moment, that something was being said that was not contained in the words, and that she was not permitted, by the rules of her own careful survival, to receive it. She said, "That is very kind," and opened her catalogue. The second voicing came at the Fenwick dinner on the 18th of December, which Cecily attended because Mrs. Drummond had pressed her again, and because she understood that absence was itself a statement she could not afford to make. The table seated 22. She was placed between the vicar and a retired colonel, who was hard of hearing, which was not the worst place she had ever been put, but from that position she had a clear view of Miss Fenwick at the far end of the table, and Miss Fenwick had a clear view of her. "Is that the same gown?" she heard Miss Fenwick say to the woman on her left, not troubling to lower her voice. "I begin to think she has nothing else." The threadbare little governess. One does feel for her, but really. Lady Fenwick, 3 seats away, said nothing. Cecily ate her soup and spoke to the vicar about the library's opening date, which they had set for the 2nd week of January. The vicar was enthusiastic. The colonel contributed a remark about books being damned useful. Cecily agreed that they were. She did not look at Miss Fenwick, and she did not permit her face to do anything at all. And when the dinner was over and the women withdrew, and Lady Fenwick said to her, with genuine warmth that was somehow worse than none at all, "You are always so composed, Miss Vane," Cecily said, "Thank you," and meant it to close the subject, and it did. The Marquess had been at the dinner. He was seated near the head of the table on Lord Fenwick's right, and she had not looked at him directly after the initial greetings. She told herself, learning to manage the situation sensibly. Whatever she had felt in the schoolmaster's room was a consequence of cold and solitude, and a natural susceptibility to anyone who asked her a practical question, with evident interest in the answer. It was not a feeling that had a future, and she was a woman who lived in futures, or the near approximation of them. He was on the step behind her when she collected her coat. "Allow me," he said, and held it. She stood and allowed him to put it over her shoulders, which was conventional. And yet the 2 seconds in which his hands rested briefly at the back of her collar, steadying the fabric, were not conventional at all, not in the space they occupied in her chest. "The library opens in January," she said, "because something had to be said. I know. Your donation made it possible. The catalogue made it possible. The catalogue was yours." She turned to face him. The hall was full of other people leaving, coats and voices, and the sound of horses being brought round, and she was very aware of all of it as something happening at a distance from where she was standing. "Good evening, my lord," she said. "Miss Vane," he said. She went out into the cold. She walked back to Barrow Street, and she did not let herself think about his hands at her collar until she was safely inside, and then she sat down on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms together and breathed. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She was a woman of no fortune, no family to speak of, and a gown that the dinner table had noticed and discussed. He held one of the oldest titles in the county, could marry anyone. His estate was the finest house in 2 counties, and who had not, in 14 months, attended a single social occasion with any visible interest in any eligible woman present. Whatever attention he offered her was curiosity or philanthropy, or something she could not name that would resolve into nothing as soon as the season supplied him with appropriate options. She had been in a version of this room before, a borrowed room, a cold room, a room that did not belong to her, and she knew what happened to women who mistook generosity for something else. She blew out the candle and went to bed. She had told almost no one about her father's debts. She had told Mrs. Drummond, because Mrs. Drummond had taken her in and deserved the truth. And she had told the solicitor because he required it. And she had told no one else because the information served no purpose, and because there is a particular shame in the reduction of a family's situation that is separate from the situation itself. A shame that feels like an accusation, even when it is only arithmetic. Her father had been a clergyman of modest living and considerable library, and he had also been a man who could not refuse a friend in need, and when he died in March he left behind £314 of debt, and a daughter who had spent the preceding year managing his household and had not noticed, quite, how far the figures had drifted. She had managed. She was still managing. There was, all the same, a version of her life in which she could see, with uncomfortable clarity, how the managing would proceed. The piano lessons, the catalogue work, the borrowed rooms, the careful gowns worn one season past their end, the gradual narrowing of what was possible until what was possible became only this and nothing else. She did not share this with anyone. She was not a woman who shared this kind of thing. The 3rd of January brought the opening of the library, which was attended by 41 people, which was more than the room comfortably held, and by Alden Mere himself, who stood at the edge of the crowd and said nothing, and watched everything. Cecily moved through the room greeting people and answering questions, and did not look at him directly for the first hour, because the room was full and she was needed, and because she did not trust herself to look at him in a room full of people and produce a face equal to the occasion. Mrs. Drummond had come wrapped in 3 shawls and determined to stay the full 2 hours. She found Cecily near the catalog table and pressed her hand. "You did this," Mrs. Drummond said. "We did this," Cecily said. "Do not be gracious at me, child. I provided the books and the moral support. You did the work." She looked across the room to where the Marquess stood. "He gave 170 volumes," she said. "I had 112. I count that a competition I have lost. It was a donation, not a competition." "Everything is a competition, my dear. You are simply too young to have noticed." She squeezed Cecily's hand. "He has looked at you 4 times since we arrived, and you have not looked back once. I count that a competition as well, and I am uncertain who is winning." Cecily said, "You must be cold, Mrs. Drummond. Let me find you a chair by the window." She found the chair and arranged the shawls, and turned to discover the Marquess standing 2 feet behind her with 2 cups of tea and an expression of careful neutrality. "Your aunt is determined," he said. "She is always determined. It is her primary quality. A useful one." He offered her the tea. She took it. They stood side by side facing the room, which was the safest possible configuration, the one that required neither of them to look at the other. And for several minutes they simply looked at the library that had not existed 3 months ago and was now full of people reading things. "My brother would have liked this," he said. She turned to look at him then, because she could not help it. "He was a schoolmaster's son," the Marquess said. "Before he was anything else, he believed in the utility of books very strongly. He used to say that a man who could not read could not understand what was being done to him. He was looking at the shelves. I used to argue with him about it. Were you wrong? Frequently. A pause. He generally was not. She did not say she was sorry again. She had said it once. Instead, she said, what was his name? He told her. She filed it with care. She understood, with a precision that was almost painful, that she was being shown something, and that the showing was deliberate, and that nothing she could do with that information would be simple. This is the moment that keeps people watching when a careful person lowers their guard by 1 degree. Do not go anywhere. January passed. The library opened 4 days a week, and Cecily managed the catalog, and the vicar managed the lending records, and people came and chose books, and returned them, and the project improbably worked. The Marquess came on the 2nd Tuesday of each month, which was when the new acquisitions were shelved, and on those Tuesdays he and Cecily spoke for 20 minutes about books, and nothing else, which was the most honest 20 minutes of her week. He brought the Montaigne back with notes penciled in the margins. She read the notes. She did not tell him she had read them. They were precise and sometimes dry, and once or twice at the foot of a long passage about loss were marked only with a small, deliberate line, the way a person marks a thing they will return to. She thought about those lines for the better part of a week. The difficulty arrived in February, not as a single event, but as a sequence of 3 that occurred over the course of 9 days, and which Cecily would later understand as the mechanism of a particular kind of destruction. The first arrived when Lady Fenwick called on Mrs. Drummond on the 9th of February and spent 45 minutes there, during which Cecily was in the next room giving a lesson. She heard enough to understand the visit's purpose. Lady Fenwick wished to make clear, with every appearance of kindness, that a woman of Miss Vane's situation ought not to allow herself to form any expectations arising from a gentleman's philanthropic interest in a village project. Such expectations would not serve her. The world was not unmerciful to a practical woman who understood its limits. Mrs. Drummond, from what Cecily could hear, received this with a particular gracious sweetness, and said nothing at all that committed to any position, which was a form of response that Cecily had long admired. The second came on the 14th, when Miss Fenwick appeared at the library with 2 friends, and she arrived at the catalogue desk when Cecily was there alone. and she said pleasantly to her companions, "This is the Vane girl. She manages the catalog. Is it not admirable what some people manage when they have nothing else to occupy them?" And then to Cecily, "I understand Lord Aldenmere has been very generous to your little project." "His lordship has been very generous to the parish," Cecily said. "Indeed, he can afford to be generous in all sorts of directions." Miss Fenwick smiled. "We were speaking only last week about the Dunmore girl." "You have heard about Miss Dunmore, I suppose? Her family has the estate at Whitfield. Lovely girl, the right sort of match for him. Everyone agrees." Cecily found the volume the young woman behind Miss Fenwick had asked to borrow and recorded the loan in the ledger and said, "That will be due back in a fortnight." The third was on the 17th, when she arrived at the library to find a calling card on the catalogue desk, and the calling card was from Miss Eliza Dunmore, and it read simply, in a very pretty hand, that she had heard so much about the library and hoped to visit soon. That was all. It was not designed as a weapon. It did not need to be. The Marquess arrived at 11 on the second Tuesday of February, as usual, and Cecily was not usual, which was the problem. She was composed, she was fully composed, but the composition was of the kind that requires significant internal architecture. And she was aware, in a way she generally was not, of the architecture's presence. He knew immediately. She watched him know it, the small change in his face when he saw her, the almost imperceptible consideration. "The new acquisitions?" he said. "On the east shelf," she said. "2 volumes of natural philosophy and a collection of sermons we will almost certainly not be able to give away." He did not move toward the east shelf. He stayed near the door. "Something is wrong," he said. "Everything is in perfect order." "That is not what I asked." She straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "I had a visit from some library patrons last week," she said. "One of them mentioned Miss Dunmore." Silence. "I understand," she said carefully, "that she is an admirable person. I hope she will become a frequent patron." She looked up from the papers and found him looking at her steadily. "My lord, I have not spoken to Miss Dunmore," he said. "That is entirely your own business, Cecily," her given name in his voice. For the first time, it landed exactly as she had known it would, which was the problem. "That is entirely your own business," was a perfectly good sentence, and it served to close the subject, and she had said it clearly, and she was not going to look at him. And then she did look at him, because her body made the choice before her mind could intervene. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped when there was still appropriate distance between them. And that distance was worse than none at all. "I brought books because you were building something," he said. "I came on Tuesdays because the project needed oversight, and because on Tuesdays I could speak to you, without performing anything, for anyone. I sent the Montaigne because I thought you would read it the way he would have read it, carefully, and argue with the margins. And I was right. I have not spoken to Miss Dunmore. I have no intention of speaking to Miss Dunmore." She said nothing. Her hands were flat on the catalogue desk. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you deserve to have the information, my lord." She said, "I am a woman with no fortune, and a gown the assembly room found amusing. Whatever you are saying to me, I do not know what use I am supposed to make of it." He said, "Then I have not been clear enough." He went to the east shelf and looked at the natural philosophy volumes, and stayed another 40 minutes and said nothing that was not about books. And when he left, he said good afternoon, and she said good afternoon, and the door closed. She sat down in the chair behind the catalogue desk and pressed her hands together, and did not allow herself to do anything else. The Ashworth Assembly held its February ball on the 22nd. Cecily had not planned to attend. She had no particular reason to attend. She had not been to an event since the Fenwick dinner, and the gown was the same gown it had always been, which she was tired of, which she suspected the assembly was tired of as well. She attended because Mrs. Drummond said she must, and because she was not, she told herself a woman who retreated, and because retreating would have meant sitting in the cold room on Barrow Street and thinking about the library, and thinking about the library was inseparable now from thinking about a conversation she could not resolve and had no vocabulary to resolve safely. She arrived at 8, and she wore the gray gloves, and she kept her chin level, and she did not look immediately for him, which was a discipline she maintained for approximately 4 minutes before she found him by the staircase. He was not alone. Miss Fenwick was speaking to him, animated, her diamonds very bright, and beside her was a young woman Cecily did not recognize, but whose dress and bearing were those of the right family, the right station, the right everything, and she understood, without being told, that this was Miss Dunmore. Lady Fenwick materialized at Cecily's left shoulder. "There is Miss Dunmore," Lady Fenwick said pleasantly. "Is she not lovely? I believe the families have been corresponding. One does so hope it comes to something. It would be the right arrangement, everyone thinks. Someone ought to tell the poor man that philanthropy is charming. But it is not a foundation for a life." Cecily said, "It was very kind of you to invite me this evening, Lady Fenwick, because that was the sentence that ended conversations," and she moved away before Lady Fenwick could reply. She found a position near the windows and stood with her back to the glass and felt the familiar cold at her shoulders and thought, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she had been wrong to come. Not because of the room, or the gown, or any of it. Because she had walked into a space she did not belong in. She had allowed herself to believe that belonging was a thing that could be built from catalog work and a borrowed shelf and careful conversation on Tuesday mornings, and that belief was a luxury she could not afford. She turned to collect her wrap. The room shifted. She did not understand it at first, only that something had changed in the acoustic of the space, the particular quality of a ballroom when its attention moves. She turned back. He was crossing the floor. He was not crossing it toward the supper table or the staircase or the door. He was crossing it toward her. The room understood this before she did. She could see it happening in the faces, the small turn of heads, the stilling of conversations. Lady Fenwick's fan stopped mid-motion, Miss Fenwick's mouth slightly open, Miss Dunmore standing perfectly still with an expression of someone who has just understood what a situation actually is. He stopped in front of her. The room was very quiet. He bowed. Precisely, correctly, a full bow of the kind a Marquess does not offer a woman of no particular standing in an assembly room full of witnesses, unless he intends the witnesses to understand exactly what the bow means. He said, "Miss Vane, will you do me the honor of this dance?" It was not a question. It was, in its form, a question, but it had the structure of the other things he had said to her, the commands that were not commands, the offers that were decisions already made. She looked at him, and what she understood in that moment was that she was standing in the exact room where she had first walked in and heard laughter, and the room was now entirely silent, and he had made it silent, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen only in the schoolmaster's room when no one else was there. Patient and certain and entirely unguarded. She gave him her hand. The silence held for the 3 seconds it took for them to move to the floor, and then the room exhaled, and the music began, and she heard, somewhere behind her, the sound of Lady Fenwick saying something that may have been an attempt to recover the situation, but it did not reach her, because she was concentrating on the fact that she was dancing, and the room had turned and his hand was at her waist, and his face was very close, and the gray glove was warm now from the heat of his hand through it. They danced, one dance, and then a second, which was the number that meant something in this room, the number that made an announcement to everyone watching. And when the music stopped, he kept her hand for 1 moment longer than required, which was the number that made an announcement to her. "My lord," she said quietly. "I owe you a clearer sentence," he said, equally quietly. "I intend to call on Mrs. Drummond tomorrow morning. Will you be there?" She looked at him. "Cecily," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will be there." He released her hand with the formality the room required, and bowed, and she curtsied, and then the room came back in its entirety, the noise and the candles and the press of bodies and Lady Fenwick's face, which had achieved an expression of composed reassessment, and Miss Fenwick, who was looking at her slippers, and Miss Dunmore, who had with the dignity that spoke well of her actual character, turned to speak to someone else entirely. He was there at 10. The next morning, Mrs. Drummond was in the sitting room with her shawls and her determination, and Cecily was at the small table with the catalog pages she had brought home, out of habit. And when he came in, he looked at her, and then at the catalog pages, and said nothing about them which she appreciated. He had brought a letter from his solicitor, which was itself a statement, and he put it on the table. And he said, "I've been trying to say something to you since November. I appear to require the written form." "You have said things to me clearly," Cecily said. "I have said them as clearly as I could manage," he said. "I am not a man given to clarity of this particular kind." He looked at the pages. "My brother used to say I expressed affection through resource allocation." He was not wrong. 172 books, she said. 172, he agreed. And the something in his face that was almost a smile arrived this time all the way. She read the letter. It was practical and precise and legally thorough. The document of a man who understood that a woman of limited means required a settlement of sufficient weight to constitute real security, rather than a courtesy. And the settlement he proposed was more than sufficient. And she sat with it for a moment and thought of the cold room on Barrow Street and the ink stains on her fingers and the gown that the assembly room had found amusing. And she thought of 9 months of catalogue work at the library that now held 284 volumes and lent them to 41 regular patrons. And she thought of the Montaigne, with its penciled lines at the margins. And she said yes. He said, "You were certain." "I have been certain, for longer than is comfortable to admit," she said. Mrs. Drummond from her chair said, "I would like some acknowledgement that I arranged this by insisting." She attended 2 events she did not want to attend. "Your contribution is noted," the Marquess said, with a gravity that held the smile at its exact limit, "and will be incorporated into the official account." "See that it is," Mrs. Drummond said, and rang for tea. Spring came to the village with its usual combination of mud and optimism, and the library opened its lending records for the season with 67 active patrons, and the East Shelf acquired a new section on natural history that had been donated by the estate and catalogued by Cecily in the small room off the main hall of Aldenmere, which was where she worked now, because the room had a fire and the ink dried better in warmth. She brought the Montaigne back to the estate library and shelved it between its companions, and she smoothed the cover once with her thumb because it seemed right. On the morning of the 1st of April, she walked through the house with the particular unhurried ease of someone who has been given leave to learn the geography of a place. And she paused in the gallery where his brother's portrait hung, and she stood there for a while. The portrait showed a younger man, lighter in the face, with the look of someone perpetually ready to be amused by the world. Below it, on the narrow shelf, sat 2 objects side by side, a small prayer book with a worn spine, and a single gray glove. She looked at the glove for a moment. It was hers, the left one from the pair. She had worn that February night, and she had not known until now where it had gone. She left it there. It was already where it belonged. Outside the window, the estate grounds were coming into color, and the library in the village was open, and somewhere in the house she could hear his voice giving a direction to the steward, level and unhurried. And she stood in the gallery, with the light coming in at an angle, and felt the weight of the winter lift from her shoulders, like a coat she had worn one season past its end, and was done with now.